A millionaire is saved by a homeless woman. Days later. He hires her to work in his company. What she did shocked him. A secret she was hiding completely changed his life. Before we dive into the story, leave a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. John Wick was attending an event. He decided to leave early to avoid the long, dull speeches. He walked to meet a millionaire is saved by a homeless woman. Days later. He hires her to work in his company. He is shocked by what she did. A secret she was hiding completely changed his life. Before we dive into the story, leave a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. John Wick was attending an event. He decided to leave early to avoid the long, dull speeches. He walked to meet his driver, who absent-mindedly turned a corner. He realized too late that he had entered an alley. Before he could turn back, 3 men appeared. Their faces showed a mix of opportunism and menace. "Well, look what we have here, a rich guy lost in the wrong part of town." One of them sneered. John stayed calm. His heart raced. He wasn't naive, he knew they weren't there for small talk. "You want money?" he asked. "Trying to keep the everything's under control. We want everything big shot. Watch your wallet," the man said, stepping closer. Before John could respond, a firm voice rang out from the end of the alley. "The police are on their way. I suggest you leave before it's too late." The man turned to see a young woman standing there, holding a metal rod. Her clothes were worn. Her face showed the hardships of life on the streets. Her determination was. She was very confident. "Who are you to tell us what to do?" one of them said, trying to scare her. He reached for the rod. She quickly hit him on the head. "I'll call the police," she said firmly. "If you're smart, you'll run now." The man hesitated. The faint sound of sirens, even if not intended for them, made the leader's companions exchange worried glances. "Let's go." "It's not worth it," one of them muttered. "This is an overreaction." "Rich boy," the leader threatened before disappearing into the shadows with the others. John stood frozen, trying to understand what had just happened. His eyes finally met the woman's. She was still gripping the rod tightly. "Did you really call the police?" he asked, sounding surprised. She smiled faintly, lowering the rod. "No. I don't even have a phone," she said. But they didn't need to know that. John remained silent for a moment, taking in the reality of what had just happened. This woman, with her worn his clothes and tired face, had saved his life. "Thank you," he said, finally speaking. "No need to thank me. Just be more careful where you walk," she replied, already turning to leave. He felt he had to say something more. "Wait," he called out, stepping toward her. She stopped and turned slowly, as if he knew what he was going to say. "At least let me repay you and tell me your name." She looked at him, her gaze steady. "My name is Layla. I didn't do it for money. Even if I had, I doubt you could give me what I really need." "Then, tell me, what do you need?" He didn't know why he was pressing. Something about her intrigued him deeply. She was quiet for a moment, weighing her options. She had a new life. He wondered if it was worth answering. "But I don't think that's something you can provide." He frowned, intrigued. Without thinking, he pulled a card from his pocket and held it out to her. "My name is John Wick. If you ever change your mind, call me." She hesitated before taking the card, her eyes searching his for sincerity. "Maybe I will," she said, slipping the card into her pocket before leaving into the night. 2 days passed. John still thought about the young woman. He told himself it was just curiosity. After all, it wasn't every day that someone so unexpected crossed his path. While reviewing reports in his office, his routine was interrupted by a call from his receptionist. "Mr. Wick." A woman came to see him. He didn't know her. He thought he did. He went down to the lobby. There she was. She was the same woman who had saved him in the alley. Now she was cleaner and looked serious. "I can't believe I'm here. I didn't have a choice. I need your help." Her voice was firm. He noticed that she was shaking a little. John was unsure. He looked at the young woman in front of him, feeling the same curiosity he'd felt in the alley. There was something about her that fascinated him. He couldn't put his finger on it. He was used to people asking for things. Layla was different. She seemed almost reluctant to be there, as if asking for help was her last resort. "Layla, what can I do for you?" John asked. John crossed his arms, maintaining the professional attitude he often used in negotiations. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "I need a job. I'm looking for something stable to start over. And since you said I could call, I'm here." John thought for a moment. Hiring a stranger, especially someone coming from the streets, was risky. He also knew the instincts that had brought him to the top of the business world rarely failed. His instincts told him that Layla was special. "All right. I have an opening for a personal assistant. The job is simple: accompany me to events, manage schedules, handle day-to-day tasks. More today's tasks. Do you think you can do it?" Layla looked at him, surprised. She hadn't expected such a direct response. Such a good offer. Her expression quickly became serious, as if she were trying to protect herself. "Why are you giving me this opportunity?" Layla asked. "You don't even know me." John smiled slightly. "You have courage. I want to see where that can take you," he said. She stared at him for a few more seconds before nodding her head slightly. "All right. I'll take it," Layla said the next day. She arrived on time at 7 in the morning. She was wearing simple clothes that looked like they were borrowed or bought secondhand. John welcomed her into his office, where the team John was already busy at work. When he introduced her to the others, they reacted in a certain way. They looked at her curiously, whispered, even looked at her with disdain. John didn't care. He knew that most people in his company cared more about how things looked than how well they worked. Layla had already shown that she was determined. "Here's your desk," he said. He led her to a spot near his office where a chair and computer were waiting. "Your first task is to organize the week's appointments. I want everything detailed and mistake-free. There is no charge for mistakes." "Free, got it," Layla replied sarcastically. He hadn't expected that. John smirked slightly. He liked that. It was interesting to work with someone who wasn't afraid to speak their mind. As she began to familiarize herself with the job, John observed her from a distance. Layla was efficient, even without corporate experience. She had a natural ability to learn quickly and solve problems. Yet he also noticed a barrier around her. Something she clearly wasn't ready to share. During the lunch break, John found her. She was sitting alone in the break room, eating a sandwich she'd brought in. It was simple, wrapped in plastic. He sat down in a chair across from her. "How's it going?" he asked. "Good," she said. "It's not as complicated as I thought." "Great," he said. "But if you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." He paused. Then added, "You know, you don't have to bring your own lunch. Right? We have a buffet service for all employees." She looked up, wary. "I'm not here to take advantage of the benefits. I just want to do my job." John nodded, respecting her stance. He wondered how long it would take for Layla to realize she didn't have to be on guard all the time. As time went on, Layla started to adjust to her new surroundings. She was efficient. She kept her distance from everyone, including John. That didn't stop her from standing out. During an important meeting with investors, she noticed a critical error in the financial reports and corrected it before anyone else noticed. Her precision impressed even the most experienced employees. After the meeting, he called her into his office. "You saved the day today." He gestured for her to sit down. "How did you catch that mistake so quickly?" Layla gave a small smile. Her eyes showed sadness. "I used to be good with numbers. Before everything fell apart." John didn't press further. He knew she would talk when she was ready. That brief glimpse into Layla's past only deepened his curiosity. Despite the progress, not everything was easy. Some colleagues didn't hide their prejudice toward Layla. One afternoon, as she was on her way out of the office when she overheard two employees talking. "What do you think she did to get this job? Maybe she has something on the boss. There's no way he hired her just for her skills." Layla stopped in the hallway but didn't turn around. Instead, she took a deep breath and kept walking. She knew it wasn't worth confronting them. Their words lingered in her mind. The next day, John noticed something unusual. During a discussion about an important project, one of the same employees who had criticized Layla, he tried to make her stop talking. Layla kept talking. "If you don't understand my idea, I can explain it better. Or would you rather I just agree with everything you say?" she said, smiling. Her tone made it clear that she was challenging him. John watched the scene with a mix of pride and admiration. Layla wasn't just brave, she knew how to handle problems without getting upset. That night, John stayed late at the office while he reviewed reports. He heard footsteps in the hallway. Looking up, he saw Layla was standing at the door. "I'm still here," she said. "I wanted to thank you for giving me this chance," he said, surprised. "I know it wasn't easy for you," she said. John tilted his head, studying her. "You're doing better than I expected," he said. "But something tells me I haven't seen everything you're capable of yet." "You're right," she said, laughing softly. As she walked away, John felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Layla was different from anyone else there. Time flew by. Layla's presence in John's company. She had an unexpected impact. She worked hard and efficiently. Her direct attitude and quiet personality were a mystery to everyone. John watched her closely, intrigued by how someone so reserved could adapt so well to the corporate world. He knew Layla was hiding something. He wasn't the type to push. He preferred to let things unfold naturally. However, during a typical afternoon meeting with his team, Layla surprised him again. "Mr. Wick. Before we proceed with the proposal, I see there's a part here that could cause legal problems later," she said, pointing to a detail in a document. The room went quiet. Everyone looked at her. A few people made quiet comments. After all, who did she think she was to point out a mistake in such an important meeting? John leaned forward to examine what Layla had identified after a few seconds. He nodded slowly. "She's right," he said, looking around at the others. "If we don't fix this now, we could face serious problems," though no one said anything. Their reactions were clear. Some seemed impressed, while others looked uncomfortable. Layla, however, remained. She was calm. After the meeting, John called her into his office. "You notice things very well. Where did you learn that?" he asked. Closing the door, Layla hesitated for a moment before replying. "I've always been good with contracts and numbers." She didn't give specific details. "That's more than just being good. You caught composed." After the meeting, John called her into his office. "You have a sharp eye for detail. Where did you learn that?" he asked. Closing the door, Layla hesitated for a moment before replying. "I've always been good with contracts and numbers." She was clearly avoiding specifics. "That's more than just being good. You caught something no one else did. Not even my lawyers." John crossed his arms, studying her. "There's more to you than you're letting on. Isn't there?" Layla avoided his gaze but didn't answer. The silence that followed was almost as revealing as any words she could have said. John decided not to press further. He knew the answers would come. John studied her, not saying anything. "There's more to you than you're letting on. Isn't there?" he said. "Not exactly," Layla answered, looking away. The silence that followed was almost as revealing as any words she could have said. John decided not to press further. He knew the answers would come. Later that week, John was invited to a charity event and decided to bring Layla as his professional guest. He wanted to test her in a more challenging environment where etiquette and formalities were as crucial as business itself. "Have you ever been to an event like this?" he asked as they walked toward the main entrance. "Have you ever been to an event like this?" he asked as they walked toward the main hall. "Not exactly," she replied, glancing around curiously. The hall was stunning, with crystal chandeliers and impeccably set tables. Guests wore expensive attire and spoke in hushed tones, creating an air of exclusivity. John watched Layla out of the corner of his eye, trying to gauge her reactions. Surprisingly, she seemed at ease. Although her clothing wasn't the most sophisticated, Layla carried herself with elegance. As if the setting wasn't entirely foreign to her. As they approached a table filled with prominent investors, John was greeted with polite smiles and handshakes. He introduced Layla as his assistant. To his surprise, she handled herself with confidence. "Well, you're contributing to the conversation. You've got a sharp team. I always choose the best people. I always choose the best people." John, one of the investors, remarked, clearly impressed by Layla's insights. "Well, confidently contributing to the conversation. I always choose the best people. I always choose the best people." John stepped away to grab a drink. When he returned, he found Layla speaking with an older woman who seemed particularly interested in her. "So how do you know John?" the woman asked. Smiling politely. Layla hesitated. She knew she couldn't reveal the full truth. "I've only been working as his assistant for a short time," she replied, keeping a neutral tone. "Assistant? Interesting. You carry yourself differently. Like. Have you ever been to an event like this?" John asked as they walked toward the main entrance. "Someone who's been in a place like this before." Layla didn't respond. The idea lingered in her mind. Once the conversation ended, she found John near the bar. "People love to analyze everything, don't they?" she said, trying to ease the tension. "It's part of the game," he replied, handing her a glass of water. "But you handled it well." Layla gave a faint smile and changed the subject. John could tell there was something in her past that didn't quite add up. The next morning, while working in the office, John started looking into Layla's background and he didn't know exactly what he was hoping to find. He wanted answers. After some searching, he came across something caught John's attention as they walked, an old article about a high society family caught in a devastating financial scandal. At the center of the story was a young woman who looked remarkably like Layla. John printed the article and kept it to ask her later that afternoon while they were organizing documents in his office. John asked her if she had ever been to an event like this. As she reached to pick up a photo, John noticed something interesting. It was a portrait of a young woman standing beside an elegant couple. The same young woman he'd seen in the article. "Who's this?" John asked, pointing at the photo. Layla quickly picked up the envelope, tucking the photo back inside. "No one important." John noticed that Layla's voice was firm. Her hands were trembling slightly. "I found something today," he said, holding up the printed article. "You're Layla Reed from the Reed family, right?" Layla froze. It looked like she was deciding whether to deny it or finally tell the truth. After a few seconds, she took a deep breath. "Yes. I have. Or at least I did." John stared at Layla, who was holding the article firmly, though his voice remained calm. This was in contrast to the tension in the air. Layla glanced at the document briefly before looking away, as if the words on the page could open old wounds. "Why didn't you ever mention this?" he asked, his tone steady. It was the same tone he used during critical business decisions. Layla took another deep breath, as though gathering the courage to confront a difficult truth. "Because that's not my life anymore," she said. Her voice, though controlled, carried a weight John recognized. "My family lost everything. When that happens, you learn to leave the past behind." John put the article down on the desk. He still looked at her. He said, "Leaving the past behind is one thing. This is different. This article explains how your family fell apart. It doesn't explain how you ended up on the streets." Layla pressed her lips together, clearly unsure what to say. After a moment of silence, she finally spoke. "My father tried to keep up appearances while everything was falling apart. When he realized it was all collapsing, he decided to turn me into a solution." John frowned, confused. "A solution?" "He arranged a marriage for me." "Layla," she said it bluntly, her voice angry. "I was supposed to be a gift for one of the investors. Someone who could give enough money to save the company." Her words hung in the air like an unchangeable decision. John couldn't hide his shock. He had seen careful, cold business decisions, using one's own daughter as a bargaining chip. Crossed every possible line. You ran away. Yes. I did. She crossed her arms as if trying to shield herself from painful memories. I left before it was too late. Running away comes with a price. I learned. John didn't respond right away. He understood what it was like to grow up with strict family expectations. He'd never faced anything so extreme. He watched her, trying to figure out what she needed to hear. The article mentions that your family's collapse started with a cancelled contract from one of my companies. He paused, choosing his words carefully. How much did you know about that? Layla blinked, surprised. For a moment, it seemed like he'd said something entirely new to her. Nothing. I never knew. What happened? She seemed real. Her voice made him doubt. All he heard was what his dad used to say. Our business partners left us when we needed them. Silence filled the room again. John felt uncomfortable. He wasn't one to avoid responsibility. At that moment, he realized that he might have indirectly caused this young woman's problems. Later that night, John went to his office. He opened old drawers and digital files he hadn't looked at in a while. John spent years searching for answers. After hours of searching, he found an old report from a merger early in his career as CEO. The report included a decision to end contracts with smaller companies that weren't making a profit. One of those companies was Reed Enterprises. The document also included recommendations from financial consultants. They said that John needed to make quick decisions to make sure the merger was profitable. John recognized his signature on the last page, approving the actions. He closed his eyes for a moment. Felt a mix of guilt and frustration. He knew that as CEO, he was responsible for the company's decisions, even if he hadn't been the one to make them. He didn't know how to tell Layla this. He was afraid she might never forgive him. In the days that followed, Layla noticed John was quieter than usual. Although he was generally reserved, he now seemed distant and lost in thought. She could tell that learning about her family had upset him. She chose not to pressure him. Their relationship was built on a fragile foundation. Any added pressure John made her nervous. Over the next few days, he seemed even more determined to help her. He started working directly with Layla on major projects and delegating fewer tasks to the team. It was as though he wanted to make up for past mistakes by helping her excel. Here's the draft of the new hotel project, Layla said, placing the papers on John's desk. He picked them up and reviewed the notes. Excellent work, John said, pausing to look at her. You know you have a talent for this, don't you? Layla gave a slight smile. But she didn't want to talk about it anymore. I just want to do my best. John knew there was more to it. Layla wasn't just efficient, she seemed determined to prove something to herself or perhaps to the world. Later that week, while organizing old company files for a project, Layla came across a folder that caught her attention. It was a set of detailed financial reports, all related to the period when her family faced bankruptcy. Among the pages, she saw something that made her heart race, a memo signed by John. The message emphasized the importance of cutting costs and ending contracts with companies that weren't performing well. Layla felt shocked and angry. It wasn't just a bureaucratic decision, it was a sentence that had changed her life. She grabbed the papers and went straight to John's office. When she entered, he was on the phone but quickly ended the call when he saw her. What's going on? She placed the documents on his desk, crossing her arms as she looked at him. You knew her voice was steady. It sounded sad. You knew what those decisions meant for companies like mine. John looked at the papers and immediately recognized the memo. He took a deep breath before responding. I didn't know the full impact, Layla said. Looking at him. At the time. I was only thinking about the numbers. About keeping the company stable. And what about the people, she asked. Her tone made it clear that she was frustrated. Did you think about the families that would be affected, she asked. John didn't answer right away. He knew that any explanation would sound empty at that moment. I can't change what happened. He finally said. But I want to help you move forward. Layla closed her eyes for a moment. Trying to calm herself. She knew. He was being honest. It was still hard to accept that her pain had been caused by such cold decisions. I don't want charity, Layla said. Her voice softening but still firm. What I want is to understand why people like you think they can decide others' fates without considering the consequences. John hadn't expected that. John realized that Layla wasn't just questioning the past. She was trying to understand the logic of a world she hadn't chosen. You're right, he said slowly. Carefully choosing his words. I was wrong about many things. I'm trying to be different now. Layla didn't respond. Something in her expression showed she was. He understood that Layla wasn't just curious about the past. She was trying to make sense of a world she hadn't chosen. You're right, he said slowly. Choosing his words carefully. I was wrong about many things. I'm trying to be different now. Layla didn't respond. Something in her expression showed she was beginning to believe in his intentions. Even if she wasn't yet sure how to fully trust him. That night. As John reviewed more old reports. He found something unexpected. Among the notes from board meetings. There was a name he recognized, Raymond Carter. Raymond was the investor who, years ago, had been the key figure in the merger. John started to believe in his intentions. Even though he wasn't sure if he could fully trust him. That night, John found something unexpected while looking at old reports. Among the notes from board meetings, he saw a name he recognized, Raymond Carter. Raymond was the investor who, years ago, was the key figure in the merger that led to the cancellation of smaller contracts, including those of Reed Enterprises. At the time, John trusted Raymond's recommendations and those of his advisors. But now, as he reviewed the details, he noticed something unusual. There was a discrepancy between the numbers Raymond had presented and what had actually been executed. It appeared that the decisions had been manipulated to benefit a select group of investors while harming others. John closed the report. His mind racing. He knew Raymond was a strategic player. He had never imagined he might have intentionally sabotaged smaller companies to increase his profits. The next morning, John called Layla into his office. He knew that even though it might be hard for her, she deserved to hear what he had discovered. Layla. I have something to show you, he said. Handing her the report. She read it carefully. Her eyes narrowing as she processed the implications. So Raymond Carter was behind this, she asked. Still. She was trying to understand what she was reading. John nodded. He changed the data to make it look like he had the right to cancel the contracts and make more money. Layla felt angry. The name Raymond Carter sounded familiar. He was the investor her father had tried to negotiate with before everything fell apart. She said, her voice was low but full of emotion. He knows this will destroy my family. John watched her, noticing how hard she was fighting to keep her anger from consuming her. I'm going to deal with this, he said. Layla challenged him, meeting his gaze. This happened years ago. What can you do now? John gave her a faint smile. His eyes showed a strong determination. More than you realize. Over the next few days, John started taking steps to expose Raymond's actions. He used his connections and influence to start investigations into the contracts from that time. Layla closely followed his progress, feeling torn between skepticism and hope. Why are you doing this? During a private moment, she asked, doing this? He replied, it's the right thing to do. Layla didn't know what to make of it. Despite everything, she sensed that John truly wanted to make amends for the mistakes of the past. She also knew it wouldn't be enough to erase the scars. The investigation into Raymond continued. Carter began by reviewing old company records in a calm manner. What seemed like a normal check of information at first quickly got the attention of important people in the industry. Carter's name began to be mentioned in private meetings. It was clear that people were afraid of what might happen if his past was discovered. John knew something was wrong. John had faced powerful enemies before. He was surprised by how strongly Raymond reacted. Within days, John received anonymous messages and strange phone calls. They were clear warnings that someone wanted to send a message. John guessed who it was. Meanwhile, Layla felt torn. She admired John's determination to do what was right. She worried he was putting himself at risk for something she had long accepted as a tragic part of her past. You don't have to do this, she said one evening as they reviewed documents. I don't have to. I want to, he replied without hesitation. I can fix some of the damage I caused. It's worth it. Layla knew it was pointless to argue. Something had changed in John. He was different. He wasn't the cold, distant man she had met at first. This new version of him was driven by a sense of justice she never expected to see. A few days later. While Layla was organizing files in John's office, she noticed something strange, a plain envelope with no sender's information sitting on his desk. It hadn't been there before. No one had entered the office since she'd arrived. Curious. She opened the envelope and found a recent photo of herself. There was a short but scary message, stay out of this. We all lose. Layla felt scared. The threat was clear. Whoever sent it knew what was happening. She grabbed the photo and went to John's office. She interrupted his meeting with the company's directors. We need to talk now, she said firmly, ignoring the curious looks from the others in the room. John dismissed the directors and followed Layla to his office once the door was closed. She showed him the envelope and the photo. This was left on your desk, she said. Trying to stay calm, John examined the contents. His expression turning serious. This confirms what I was telling you. John ignored the others in the room and followed Layla to her office. Once they were alone, she showed him the envelope and the photo. This was left on your desk, she said. Trying to stay calm, John examined the contents. His expression turned serious. This confirms what I was afraid of, he said, tossing the photo onto the desk. Carter knows we're getting close to the truth. He's trying to intimidate us, Layla added. John, I think we should stop this. It's not worth it, she said. It is worth it, he replied, his determination unwavering. If anyone thinks they can intimidate you or stop me with threats, they're wrong. They don't know how important this is. Layla wanted to say this. She knew John wouldn't back down, but he was stubborn. which was frustrating but also admirable. As John investigated more, Layla noticed something odd. He was spending more and more time in the office. Sometimes reviewing documents late into the night. She couldn't understand how he managed to stay focused. She began to realize he seemed to be carrying a heavier burden than he let on. One evening, while they worked together, Layla broke the silence. "Why is this so important to you, John?" she asked, looking at him from across the table. "It's not," he began, then stopped. She worked on documents late into the night. She couldn't understand how he managed to stay focused. She began to realize that he seemed to be carrying a heavier burden than he let on. One evening, while they worked together, Layla broke the silence. "Why is this so important to you, John?" she asked, looking at him from across the table. "Is it just about fixing mistakes?" John paused for a moment, as if carefully choosing his words. "It's about who I want to be. For so long, I only cared about numbers. About success. Meeting you made me realize there's more to life than that." Layla stayed quiet, absorbing his words. There was something genuine in his tone. Vulnerability she hadn't expected. "Do you think it will change anything?" she asked softly. "Maybe not for everyone. For you. I hope it will." Days later, as John worked with his lawyers to gather evidence against Carter, something unexpected happened. He received a call from an unknown number. "Wick." A deep voice said on the other end. "And you're playing a dangerous game. Walk away while you still can." Carter. John immediately recognized the voice. "You've got a lot to lose, John. I on the other hand already know how to win. And make me show you what I'm capable of." John gripped the phone tightly, keeping his voice steady. "I am not afraid of you, Carter. Try whatever." She worked on the documents late into the night. She couldn't understand how he managed to stay focused. She began to realize that he seemed to be carrying a heavier burden than he let on. One evening, while they worked together, Layla broke the silence. "Why is this so important to you?" she asked, looking at him from across the table. "You want." "I'm taking this all the way." The call ended abruptly. John knew the threat was real. Carter wasn't the kind of man who bluffed. Now this was more than just business. That night, as Layla reviewed documents one last time, she found something that would change everything. It was a contract signed by Carter, detailing not only the financial cuts but also a larger scheme to acquire Reed Enterprises shares for a fraction of their actual value. She rushed to John with the contract, her hands shaking as she held the paper. "Look at this." Her voice was filled with emotion. John examined the contract, his eyes narrowing as he read. "This is." She worked on the documents late into the night. She couldn't understand how he could stay focused. She realized he seemed to be carrying a heavier burden than he let on. One evening, while they worked together, Layla broke the silence. "Why is this so important to you, John?" she asked, looking at him from across the table. "We can use this to expose everything," he finally said. Layla nodded. Fear was evident in her expression. "What if he tries to do something to you?" she asked. "He's already threatening us," John said, though he knew her concern was valid. "Don't worry about me. I've always known that standing up to people, John. It's not like Carter comes with risks." Layla wanted to believe he was prepared. Deep down, she feared what could happen. The tension grew with each passing day. The threats against John and Layla made it clear that Raymond Carter was willing to do anything to protect his secrets, while John remained steadfast. Layla couldn't hide her worry. The man who had helped her so much was now risking everything. She didn't know if she could handle the thought of losing him. One afternoon, as they reviewed the final documents in a small office, a loud noise came from downstairs. It was the kind of sound that made your heart race. Like something heavy falling. John, he looked at Layla, who seemed frozen. Stay here, he said quickly, getting up to check what was happening. John. Don't. Layla tried to stop him. He was already leaving the room, heading downstairs. John found the front door wide open, swinging in the wind. Papers were scattered across the floor. The space looked like it had been. She worked on the documents late into the night. She couldn't understand how he managed to stay focused. She began to realize that he seemed to be carrying a heavier burden than he let on. One evening, while they worked together, Layla broke the silence. Why is this so important to you, John? She asked, looking at him from across the table. It's not. He felt a sense of urgency. Something caught his eye. In the middle of the room, there was a note pinned to a shattered picture frame. This is your warning. Stop now. John took a deep breath, trying to contain his anger. He went back upstairs to the office where Layla was waiting. Was it Carter? She asked as soon as he walked in. John handed her. She couldn't understand how he stayed focused. She realized he seemed to be carrying a heavier burden than he let on. One evening, while they worked together, Layla broke the silence. Why is this so important to you? She asked, looking at him from across the table. It's not, he said without saying a word. Layla read the note and felt a knot in her stomach. They were playing with fire. Carter was making it clear he wouldn't hesitate to escalate. This has to stop, John said firmly, though his voice carried a note of desperation. I don't want you to get hurt over this, Layla said. This isn't just about you. It's about all the people Carter has hurt. John looked at her, determined. I can't let this man go unpunished. She knew it was pointless to argue. John had made up his mind. Nothing would deter him. The fear of what might happen to him nagged at her. That night, Layla stayed at John's mansion. He had insisted it was safer for her to stay there until the situation was resolved, but the safety of the house wasn't enough to quiet her thoughts, while John worked on documents downstairs. Layla wandered through the living room, her hands trembled. Her chest felt heavy. She couldn't deny it anymore. She was growing. She was attached to him in a way she hadn't expected. John wasn't just an employer or someone helping her rebuild her life. He was becoming something more. She went downstairs and found John sitting in an armchair with his laptop. He was so focused he didn't notice her until she spoke. You can't. She felt connected to John in a way she hadn't expected. He wasn't just her boss or someone helping her rebuild her life. He was becoming more than that. Determined to confront her feelings, she went downstairs and found John sitting in an armchair with his laptop. He was so focused that he didn't notice her until she spoke. You can't carry this alone, John. He looked up, surprised by the tone in her voice. I'm not alone. I have you. The words were simple. They hit Layla like a wave. She stepped closer and sat in the armchair next to his. What if something happens to you? Her voice was quieter than she intended. John was silent for a moment before answering. Nothing will happen. I promise. Layla wanted to believe him. She knew promises like that were hard to keep. She sighed, leaning forward slightly. John. I don't know how we got here. I feel like we're connected in a way I can't explain. John looked at her, his expression softening. He closed the laptop and set it aside. I feel it too. Even though I try to make sense of it. The truth is, it doesn't matter how or why, what matters is that it's happening. Layla felt a rush of emotion as he spoke, for a moment. The weight of threats and problems faded. Leaving only the connection between them, John reached for her hand. She let him. Layla, I don't know how this will end. I want you to know that I care about you more than I've ever cared about anyone else. She swallowed hard. Fighting back tears. That I care about you too. John, for a moment. They sat in silence. Holding each other's hands. That it was as if the outside world didn't exist. The next day, John received a call from an important legal contact. The evidence against Carter was complete and ready to be presented in court. John knew this would be a devastating blow to Carter. It also meant the final confrontation was near. We have what we need. Carter will be exposed. There's nothing he can do to stop it. Layla felt a mix of relief and worry. What happens now? Now I turn this over to the authorities. That he gave her a faint smile. But Carter won't go down without a fight. That we need to be prepared. Layla nodded. Though she wasn't sure how they could prepare for something so unpredictable, she knew Carter was dangerous. She trusted John's determination. That evening, as John prepared to hand over the evidence, a car pulled up in front of the mansion. The doorbell rang. A security guard announced an unexpected visitor. John went to the door and found a man in an expensive suit. He immediately recognized the face. It was one of Carter's lawyers. Wick Carter asked me to deliver a personal message. The man handed him an envelope and left without another word. John opened the envelope. Right there inside was a single sentence. If you move forward, you'll destroy more than you think. John clenched the paper tightly. His face betraying no emotion. He knew Carter was trying to scare him again. This time John wasn't scared. He went back inside and found Layla waiting in the living room. What is it? She asked. Another threat? He said, shaking his head as he placed the note on the table. But it's too late for him now. Layla didn't respond. She felt the weight of nothing will happen. He promised. I know you don't believe me. I promise. Layla sighed and leaned forward slightly. John. I don't know how we got here. I feel like we're connected in a way I can't explain. John looked at her. His expression softening. He closed the laptop and set it aside. The situation was pressing down on her. She knew the confrontation with Carter was imminent. After that, nothing would be the same. The tension in John's mansion was nearly unbearable. The final showdown with Carter was getting closer. While John was determined to see it through, Layla couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was about to happen. The next morning, John prepared to deliver the documents to the district attorney. It was a decisive moment. He knew he couldn't delay any longer. Layla watched him from a distance. Her stomach in knots. Are you sure you want to do this today? She asked. Her voice heavy with worry. We don't. I promise nothing will happen. Layla wanted to believe him. She knew promises like that were hard to keep. She sighed, leaning forward slightly. John. I don't know how we got here. I feel like we're connected in a way I can't explain. John looked at her. His expression softening. He closed the laptop and set it aside. Have another choice, Layla. John replied, adjusting his jacket. Carter's already shown us what he's capable of. The longer we wait, the more dangerous he becomes. Layla wanted to argue. Knew he was right. Still, the fear of what could happen to him was almost paralyzing. Just be careful. Please. Her voice almost broke. I promise. Layla wanted to believe him. She knew promises like that were hard to keep. She sighed, leaning forward slightly. John. I don't know how we got here. I feel like we're connected in a way I can't explain. John looked at her, his expression softening. He closed the laptop and set it aside. He held her gaze and gave her a small smile, trying to reassure her. I promise. A few hours later, as John headed to the district attorney's office, Layla stayed at the mansion, unable to focus on anything. She tried to distract herself. Her thoughts kept returning to John and the risk he was taking. Then the unexpected happened. The sound of screeching tires at the mansion's entrance caught her attention. Before she could react, men stormed into the property. Layla tried to run, was cornered before she could reach the back door. Where's Wick? One of the men demanded, gripping her tightly. I don't know, she replied. The man didn't seem convinced. Instead of pressing her further, he barked a quick order to the others, take her. He'll show up for her. Layla was forced into a black van. John was finishing his meeting with the district attorney when he got a call that would change everything. The voice on the other end was cold and threatening. Wick. We have your daughter. If you want to see her again, you'll drop everything about those documents. John felt angry. He kept his cool. Where is she? You're not in a position to ask questions. The voice said with a slight laugh. I'll call back with instructions. Don't try. John was about to say something when the phone line went dead. He grabbed the phone so tightly that he almost crushed it. He knew Carter was behind this. He didn't have much time. While Layla was being held in an abandoned warehouse, she tried to stay calm. She knew John would come for her. She looked around, searching for anything that could help her escape. The men guarding her gave her no openings. Still, her mind raced. If she couldn't find a way out, John had to wait until John arrived. John used all his contacts to find Layla. He tracked the van's last location and found clues to the warehouse where Layla was being held. John decided to go alone instead of call the police. John knew Carter would hurt Layla if he felt cornered. When John arrived, he carefully checked the area before moving. He saw two men at the entrance. John used his experience in how he was able to deal with difficult situations without being noticed. Inside the warehouse, Layla heard footsteps and became alert. One of the men went out to check the commotion. Didn't return. She knew something was happening. Then the door opened and John entered. His eyes locked on hers. John, she exclaimed, a mix of relief and fear in her voice. It's okay. I'm getting you out of here, he said. His voice calm but determined. Before they could leave, Carter appeared with two more men. Wick. You really don't know when to quit, do you? Carter said, smiling cynically. Let her go. Carter. This ends now. John stood his ground, even though he was outnumbered. Carter laughed. Before he could respond, Layla seized the moment. She shoved a nearby stack of crates, causing a distraction. John used the opportunity to free Layla. Grabbing her, she took her hand and led her out before more reinforcements arrived. Back at the mansion, Layla was shocked but relieved. John, however, seemed more focused than ever. Is it over? She asked, her voice shaking slightly. Not yet, John replied, looking out into the distance. But Carter's lost. Now we have everything we need to ensure he can't hurt anyone else. Layla looked at him, feeling grateful. Also feeling something else. John said, "Thank you for not giving up on me." He turned to her, his eyes showing that he was feeling vulnerable. "I would never give up on you." Without thinking, Layla hugged him. He hugged her back. For a moment, nothing else mattered but the fact that they were together and safe. News of the fight between John and Raymond Carter spread quickly among business people. While Carter had not yet been, John had been charged with a crime. His plans were starting to fail because he was no longer in control. The documents and evidence John had collected were now in the hands of the authorities. The prosecutor was sure that Carter would soon face the consequences of his actions. At John's mansion, Layla was trying to adjust to her new reality. Though she was safer now, she was still emotional because of recent events. She thought about what could have happened. She felt worried. John was always nearby, making sure she knew she wasn't alone. "You should get some rest," he said one evening, finding her working hard on contracts and reports. "I can't," Layla sighed, rubbing her temples. "It feels like there's always something to do. Something left unfinished." John walked over and set a cup of hot tea on her desk. "You don't have. I can't do this alone. Layla. I need your help." She looked at him and relaxed for a moment. "Thank you, John. Everything." The next day, John's lawyer gave an important update. Carter had tried to use his power to delay the case. There was a lot of evidence against him. His network of allies was beginning to crumble. He was becoming trapped. He'll try to escape before everything is revealed. The lawyer said that we need to make sure he doesn't disappear before the trial. John nodded, knowing that the situation was serious. He had dealt with powerful people before. Never someone as cruel as Carter. Meanwhile, Layla decided to visit the shelter where she had stayed before meeting John. She felt the need to reconnect with that part of her life, even though it was painful. At the shelter, she encountered. Layla saw familiar faces and heard familiar stories. This reminded her of why she wanted to rebuild her life. A young woman named Mia approached her, holding a tattered blanket. "You're Layla, right?" Mia asked, her eyes bright with curiosity. "I heard the others talking about you. How you got out of here and changed everything." Layla smiled, touched by the words. "Yes, Mia," she replied. "I'm still trying to change." The conversation with Mia reignited something in Layla. She realized her journey wasn't just about restarting her life. Also about helping others who were where she had once been, back at the mansion. Layla shared her idea with John. She wanted to create a shelter for people experiencing homelessness. Layla was surprised by John's immediate support for her project. She was grateful, knowing that with John's help, the project had a real chance of succeeding. As preparations for the shelter began, John received a message from the prosecutor. Carter had been officially charged. His arrest was imminent. The relief was immediate. But, back at the mansion, Layla shared her idea with John. She wanted to create a shelter for people experiencing homelessness. "I know it's ambitious. I think it could work," she explained. "I could manage it. I've lived through it and know what these people need." John listened intently, admiring her passion and determination. "I think it's an amazing idea," he said, smiling. "And I'll make sure you have all the resources you need." Homelessness. I know it's ambitious. I think it could work. She explained. Excited. I could manage it. I've lived through it and know what these people need. John listened intently, admiring her passion and determination. I think it's an amazing idea, he said, smiling. I'll make sure you have all the resources you need. Layla was surprised by his immediate support. Also deeply grateful. She knew that with John by her side, the project had a real chance of succeeding. As preparations for the shelter began, John received a message from the prosecutor. Carter had been officially charged. His arrest was imminent. The relief was immediate. John was happy about his support. He also felt worried. He knew that with John's help, the project might succeed. As they got ready to open the shelter, John got a message from the prosecutor. Carter had been officially charged. He was about to be arrested. John felt better. He knew the battle wasn't over. Carter was a dangerous man. Even in prison, he might try to hurt John. That evening, John and Layla sat in the garden and talked about the future. The wind was light. The trees were moving, creating a magical atmosphere. What will you do now that it's over? Layla asked. John knew the battle wasn't over. Carter was a dangerous man. Even from prison, he might try to get revenge. That evening, John and Layla sat in the garden and talked about the future. The breeze was light. The sound of the trees swaying created an almost magical atmosphere. What will you do now that it's over? Layla asked. Looking at him, John was silent for a moment, thinking about her question. I think I'll start really living, he said with a small laugh. I've spent so much time focused on numbers, business, profits that I forgot what it's like to enjoy life. Layla smiled. There was something deeper in her eyes. And you? He asked. Turning, John asked her. What are you going to do now that it's over? She took a deep breath and looked at the stars. I want to focus on the shelter. I also want to find my place. She paused, then looked at John. I think that place includes you. John felt his heart race. He knew there was something special between them. Hearing it from Layla confirmed. John knew the battle wasn't over. Carter was a dangerous man. Even from prison, he might try to get revenge. That evening, John and Layla sat in the garden and talked about the future. The breeze was light. The sound of the trees swaying created an almost magical atmosphere. What will you do now that it's over? Layla asked. Everything I've been feeling, John said. Layla, you're the best thing that's ever happened to me. He took her hand. I want to be by your side, no matter what's ahead. She smiled. Her eyes filled with emotion. The fear and uncertainty she had carried for so long began to fade. For the first time in years, she felt she could have a Raoul. John knew the battle wasn't over. Carter was a dangerous man. Even from prison, he might try to get revenge. That evening, John and Layla sat in the garden and talked about the future. The breeze was light. The sound of the trees swaying created an almost magical atmosphere. What will you do now that it's over? Future built with someone who truly cared. A few weeks later, the shelter officially opened. The inauguration was a success. Journalists, donors, local authorities visited the facility, admiring the work Layla and John had accomplished together. Layla, It was a significant milestone. Not just for helping so many people. Also as a symbol of overcoming her own past. John stayed by her side throughout the event. Watching as she passionately spoke about the project and the importance of giving people a second chance. He knew Layla had found her purpose. Which only reinforced how special she truly was. "You look amazing today," John whispered as John knew the battle wasn't over. Carter was a dangerous man. Even from prison. He might try to get revenge. That evening, John and Layla sat in the garden and talked about the future. The breeze was light. The sound of the trees swaying created an almost magical atmosphere. "What will you do now that it's over?" Layla asked. Finished speaking with a reporter. "Thank you," Layla said with a smile. Her eyes shone with more than gratitude, it was genuine happiness. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. In the days that followed. As the shelter began its operations, Layla and John finally experienced some peace. The case against Carter moved forward. Forward and with the overwhelming evidence John provided. Authorities had frozen Carter's assets and launched a detailed investigation into his other dealings. Just days later, Carter was arrested. It marked the end of Raymond Carter's empire. Even so, John knew his battle with Carter wasn't just about justice. It was also about protecting Layla. He wanted to ensure that their lives would never be threatened again. "He can't reach us anymore, right?" Layla asked one evening as they walked through the mansion's garden. "No," John said, taking her hand. "He doesn't have any power left. Even if he tried. We're not alone anymore." Layla looked at him, sensing his sincerity. John knew the battle wasn't over. Carter was a dangerous man. Even from prison. He might try to get revenge. That evening, John and Layla sat in the garden and talked about the future. The breeze was light. The sound of the trees swaying created an almost magical atmosphere. "What will you do now that it's over?" Layla asked. The first time, she believed they were safe. Over time, Layla and John's relationship grew even stronger. They shared a deep connection. Something that went beyond the circumstances that had brought them together. Layla, who once saw John as a cold and distant man, now saw someone who had found purpose in her. John knew the battle wasn't over. Carter was a dangerous man. Even from prison. He might try to get revenge. That evening, John and Layla sat in the garden and talked about the future. The breeze was light. The sound of the trees swaying created an almost magical atmosphere. "What will you do now that it's over?" Layla asked. One day, Layla sat in the garden holding a cup of tea as she admired the horizon. Since the shelter's inauguration, her life finally felt like it was falling into place. She worked hard to manage the project. Always found time for peaceful moments like this. John appeared at the door, watching her from a distance. John knew the battle wasn't over. Carter was dangerous. Even from prison. He might try to get revenge. That evening, John and Layla sat in the garden and talked about the future. The breeze was light. The sound of the trees swaying created an almost magical atmosphere. "What will you do now that it's over?" Moment before walking over. He wasn't wearing his jacket. His white shirt was rolled up at the sleeves, giving him a more relaxed look than usual. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, sitting beside her. Layla smiled softly, her eyes still on the sky. "How much life has changed in the past few months. Everything feels so surreal." John watched her without saying anything for a moment before taking her hand. It's better now. You're the reason why. Layla turned to him, surprised by how honest he sounded. Me? I think you're the one who made it all happen. No, he said, shaking his head. You made my life better. Layla, before you. All I saw were. John watched her, not saying a word. A moment before taking her hand. It's changed for the better. You're the reason for that. Layla turned to him, surprised by how honest he sounded. Me? I think you're the one who made it all happen. No, he said, shaking his head. You brought light into my life. Layla. Before you. All I saw were numbers. Contracts. Business deals. You showed me what really matters. Layla felt her heart race. John rarely expressed his feelings this way. Hearing those words made her feel truly special. John, she began. He interrupted her, leaning closer. You don't have to say anything, he said with a smile before kissing her softly. The kiss was soft but strong. As if they were trying to communicate everything they felt without words, when they pulled apart. Layla rested her forehead against his and smiled. You have a way of making me feel like I'm the only person in the world. Maybe you are. He replied, looking into her eyes. The days that followed where they kissed. It was both gentle and intense. It was as if they were trying to communicate everything they felt without words. When they pulled apart, Layla rested her forehead against his and smiled. You have a way of making me feel like I'm the only person in the world, she said. Maybe you are, he replied, looking into her eyes. The days that followed were filled with similar moments. John made a point to carve out time for Layla. Whether by helping at the shelter or planning small surprises. One weekend, he took her on a trip to the countryside, where they rented a secluded cabin surrounded by mountains and rivers. On the first night, as they sat by a fire outside the cabin, John hugged her from behind and rested his chin on her shoulder. Did you know I've never been this happy, he said softly. Layla turned to face him and raised an eyebrow. Really, she asked. You brought something into my life I didn't even know I was missing. She laughed lightly. The emotion in her eyes showed how much his words meant to her. He hugged her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. You know, I've never been this happy, he said softly. Really? Layla asked, raising an eyebrow. You brought something into my life that I didn't even know I was missing. She laughed lightly. The emotion in her eyes showed how much his words meant to her. You brought me something. 2. Peace. They kissed again. That night under the stars. They talked about their dreams, fears, the future they hoped to build together. A few months later, John decided it was time to make their relationship even more special. He planned a romantic evening at the same lakeside restaurant, where they'd had their first dinner together, but this time he had something much bigger in mind. Layla was surprised when John showed up with flowers and took her to the restaurant. The place was beautifully decorated with candles and soft lights reflecting on the lake. The dinner was perfect. She noticed John seemed nervous, which was unlike him. When they finished dessert, he stood up and gently took her hand. Layla, there's something I need to say, he began. She looked at him, curious, as he pulled a small box from his pocket. Over the past few months, you've shown me what it really means to live with you. Everything feels lighter, simpler. And he hugged her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Did you know I've never been this happy?" he said softly. "Really?" Layla asked, raising an eyebrow. "You brought something into my life I didn't even know I was missing." She laughed lightly. The emotion in her eyes showed how much his words made her happy. He opened the box, revealing a delicate diamond ring. "Layla, will you be my girlfriend?" he asked. She was speechless for a moment before breaking into a wide smile. "Of course I will. John." He slipped the ring onto her finger. They kissed, to the applause of the other restaurant guests. In that moment, Layla felt her life. He hugged her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Did you know I've never been this happy?" he said softly. Layla turned to face him. "Really?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "You brought something into my life I didn't even know I was missing." She laughed lightly. The emotion in her eyes showed how much his words evening. While preparing dinner together, Layla tried teaching John a recipe she had learned at the shelter. John, as clumsy as ever in the kitchen, ended up spilling flour all over the counter and accidentally on Layla's hair. "John," she exclaimed, pretending to be upset. "Sorry." He laughed. When he saw her covered in flour, she laughed even harder. She grabbed a handful of flour and threw it at him. Within minutes, they were both laughing and trying to clean up the mess. It was a simple moment, filled with love and companionship. A few months later, John decided it was time to take the next step. He planned a trip to a secluded beach where he intended to propose. The moment was carefully thought out. A seaside dinner at sunset. Just the two of them, with the sound of the waves in the background. As the sun dipped below the horizon, John held Layla's hand and looked into her eyes. "Layla, you're the best thing that's ever happened to me." He hugged her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "You're the happiest I've ever seen," he said softly. "Really?" Layla asked, raising an eyebrow. "Really? You brought something into my life that I didn't even know I was missing." She laughed lightly. The emotion in her eyes showed how much his words brought her to tears. He took a box from his pocket and knelt in the sand. "You've shown me what it means to love and be loved. I can't imagine my life without you. Will you marry me?" Layla brought her hands to her face, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Yes, John. 1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her as the sun disappeared into the sea. It was a perfect moment, filled with love and promises for the future. Shortly after, they began planning their wedding. They decided on something simple but meaningful. The ceremony was held at the shelter, with its residents and staff as guests. Layla. It felt right. The shelter symbolized new beginnings for so many, including. He hugged her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "You know, I've never been this happy," he said softly. "Really?" Layla asked, raising an eyebrow. "Really? You brought something into my life that I didn't even know I was missing." She laughed lightly. The emotion in her eyes showed how much his words mean. On their wedding day, John couldn't hide his emotions as he watched Layla walk down the aisle in a simple yet elegant white dress. She was radiant. He knew he had never seen anyone so beautiful. "You look amazing," he whispered when she reached the altar. "And you're about to become my husband," she replied with a smile. Their wedding vows were heartfelt, full of love and gratitude. When they said "I do," The applause filled the room. The kiss they shared marked the start of a new chapter in their lives. Months after the wedding, as they worked on plans to expand the shelter, Layla began to notice some changes. She felt more tired than usual and started to suspect something was different. After taking a pregnancy test, her suspicions were confirmed. She was pregnant. She planned a special way to share the news with John. That evening, during dinner, she handed him a small box. John opened the note and read the words, "I can't wait for you to meet our baby." He blinked a few times, confused. Then he realized what it meant. His eyes widened. He looked at Layla. "Are you pregnant?" he asked, his voice full of emotion. She nodded and smiled. "John, we're going to have a baby," she said. He stood, walked around the table, pulled her into a tight hug. "That's amazing," he said. He kissed her several times, still processing the news. "You just made me the happiest man in the world," he said. Layla laughed, her own emotions overflowing. "Are you ready for this? With you by my side, I'm ready for anything." That night, they talked about the future, imagining what it would be like to raise a child together. John couldn't stop smiling. Layla felt for the first time that everything in her life was exactly as it should be. As John and Layla embraced that night, sitting on the sofa in the mansion, they both knew they had overcome many challenges to get to that point. The past no longer haunted them. The future was full of hope and promise. Layla rested her head on John's chest, listening to the rhythm of his heartbeat. "I think we finally found our place." John smiled and kissed the top of her head. "Yes, Layla," she said. "And this is just the beginning." In that moment, they both knew they were ready to face anything together. What did you think of John's actions toward Layla? Share your opinion in the comments. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell to keep up with all our stories. Be sure to check out more heartwarming tales by clicking here on the end screen.